I think it's about time for us to get going. The preacher went a little long, so we've got to move on. In this morning's lesson, we want to study in Acts chapter 12. Last time we got down to right about verse 16 or 17, where Peter was about to leave the city, looking at the persecution of the church by the civil government. Before we enter into our study to help us prepare our minds for God's Word, we want to ask Brother Matt to direct our minds in a word of prayer. Amen. All right, last time we were looking at the persecution led by Herod Agrippa I when he came to power and took over really had control of all of the land of Israel like Herod the Great had. And he tried to please the Jewish leaders and persecuted the apostles. And just read what we went through last week real quickly if you want to read along with me. In chapter 12, verses 1 through 11, you have James beheaded and Peter imprisoned. Now about that time Herod the king laid hands on some who belonged to the church in order to mistreat them. And he had James the brother of John put to death with a sword. And when he saw that it pleased the Jews, he proceeded to arrest Peter also. Now it was during the days of unleavened bread. And when he had seized him, he put him in prison, delivering him to 4 squads of soldiers to guard him, intending after the Passover to bring him out before the people. So Peter was kept in prison, but prayer for him was being made fervently by the church of God. And on the very night when Herod was about to bring him forward, Peter was sleeping between 2 soldiers, bound with 2 chains, and guards in front of the door were watching over the prison. And behold, an angel of the Lord suddenly appeared, and a light shone in the cell. And he struck Peter's side and roused him, saying, "Get up quickly." And his chains fell off his hands. And the angel said to him, "Gird yourself and put on your sandals." And he did so. And he said to him, "Wrap your cloak around you and follow me." And he went out and continued to follow, and he did not know that what was being done by the angel was real, but thought he was seeing a vision. And when they had passed the first and second guard, they came to the iron gate that led into the city, which opened for them by itself. And they went out and went along one street, and immediately the angel departed from him. And when Peter came to himself, he said, "Now I know for sure that the Lord has sent forth his angel and rescued me from the hand of Herod and from all that the Jewish people were expecting." And when he realized this, he went to the house of Mary, the mother of John, who was also called Mark, where many were gathered together and were praying. And when he knocked at the door of the gate, a servant girl named Rhoda came to answer. And when she recognized Peter's voice, because of her joy, she did not open the gate, but ran in and announced that Peter was standing in front of the gate. And they said to her, "You are out of your mind." But she kept insisting that it was so. And they kept saying, "It is his angel." But Peter continued knocking, and when they had opened the door, they saw him and were amazed. So we're told about this great deliverance of Peter by the Lord. He sent an angel to set Peter free from the prison so that he could continue his work as an apostle. He answered the prayers of those saints in a way that is marvelous. I mean, that's all you can say about it, that they were set free. And the people are excited. They have a million questions, but Peter has just escaped from jail. He needs to leave. So he needs to shortly tell them what we just read. The story was passed on to Luke, exactly how it happened. But motioning to them with his hand to be silent, he described to them how the Lord had led him out of the prison. And he said, "Report these things to James and the brethren." And he departed and went to another place. So he gets them to be quiet, and he describes to them what we've been able to read. So, in that aspect, they're no different than us, are they? They were told the story just like we are. What was given to them to build up their faith, same things for us. That we have it written down for us, that we can read it. And he says, "Go report these things to James and the brethren." So the other apostles and elders, they evidently, some of them were meeting in another place, and they're to get the word to them that Peter is out. God delivered him, and tell them how it happened, and that he is going to another place to be safe. And we know eventually he comes back to Jerusalem because he's in Jerusalem in Acts 15 when Paul comes to town there. So what's going on back at the prison? It says, now when day came, there was no small disturbance among the soldiers as to what could have become of Peter. We can just imagine people running around in confusion and knowing that it is a death sentence if you let a prisoner go. If you fall asleep at the post or anything, you'd be put to death. You got 16 men that are going to be held accountable for what happened. Can you imagine? They're running around trying to find Peter and figure out what possibly could have happened. And, of course, they're not going to be able to find Peter. And they're not going to be able to escape the wrath of the king either. It's a sad thing to say. So, Peter was sentenced to death, and now these soldiers end up paying a price because Herod won't accept the evidence that God has intervened. And when Herod had searched for him and had not found him, he examined the guards in order that they be led away to execution. And he went down to Judea, from Judea to Caesarea, and was spending time there. So he searches all around Jerusalem for Peter, tries to find where he's escaped to, but he was unable to. And he should have been convinced like others were in the Bible. When Nebuchadnezzar saw Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego delivered from that fiery furnace, he believed in God, didn't he? And when Daniel was thrown down in that lion's den and Darius saw that he was saved from the mouth of that lion by an angel, he praised God after that was done. He accepted the evidence. Here a man is set free, Peter, in a miraculous way. He's got guards on either side of him. He's got two at the door. He's got bolted gates to keep him from getting out. Only God could have delivered him in that way, but Herod doesn't accept it. He ignores all of that evidence that this is an act of God, and he puts the men to death. 16 men. So does it tell you something about those guards that were guarding the tomb when Jesus rose from the dead? Do you think they would have just let the disciples steal his body? No way that would have happened. They knew what the penalty was. It was an angel of God that rolled away that stone and terrified them and revealed that Jesus had rose from the dead. So these soldiers pay that penalty. It shows you something about the responsibility that you had to do a proper job of guarding somebody. I think about that Philippian jailer. Don't you think about him? We're going to read about him in chapter 16. When he saw the prison doors had been shaken open by the earthquake and he thought the prisoners were gone, he was going to kill himself because he knew what the penalty would be. And Paul said, no, we're all still here. Do yourself no harm. This happened in 44 AD. That's the year Herod is going to die. So the same year Peter was in prison and was let loose, and these men were put to death. Also, you have Herod's going to be put to death by God. So he's going to pay for what he did. In verse 20, now he was very angry. He went up to Caesarea, right? That's where we're at. So Caesarea's over on the coast. You see it in the middle of the map there on the coastline is where this kind of the port city for Roman headquarters are at there in Caesarea, and he's got a palace there. Herod was angry with the people of Tyre and Sidon. Do you see Tyre and Sidon up there higher up on the coastline? They're the Phoenician cities. They're mentioned many times in the Old Testament. There's going to be there's churches established up there in the book of Acts that are in Tyre and Sidon. Famous seaports of the Phoenicians. And he was angry with those people, and with one accord they came to him, having won over Blastus, the king's chamberlain. They were asking for peace because their country was fed by the king's country. I don't know for sure exactly what it was that angered Herod that Tyre and Sidon were doing. We know how things are today. A lot of times people want to Well, they're the seaport and they're on the coast and all your shipping and everything goes through there. Maybe they were taxing things too much. They did something that offended Herod's in those cities. And then they were afraid when Herod Agrippa I there is angry and may take retribution on them, may even go to war with them. He is also in charge of where all the grain comes from in Palestine, so he could cut off their food supply. So they have to do some political work, and they come to Caesarea, and they win over one of his most important advisors, this Blastus, that was chamberlain, an officer over the bedchamber, somebody that was, almost like a body servant to, you think about the chief butler in Downton Abbey or whatever, that's always with the head of the house everywhere. Well, the chamberlain was that way with King Herod. He's right there every day, all the time with him. So if you get him on your side and he can whisper in the king's ear, then that'll help your cause, right? And so they win over Blastus to, try to get him to be merciful to Tyre and Sidon and make peace with them. And they get a large delegation to come down and try to flatter Herod to making peace with them. And there is an appointed day that is set for a festival, and they are all in the amphitheater. You can picture all of these throngs of people there, and all of these people from Tyre and Sidon are there to try to butter up Herod. And it says, on an appointed day, Herod, having put on his royal apparel, took his seat on the rostrum and began delivering an address to them. And the people cried out, "The voice of a God and not a man." They're laying it on thick, right? And this is not just recorded here in the Bible. This is recorded in Josephus' history too. So we have secular history of this happening this day. There's different, things applied to why it happened. But he was struck in his stomach that day, and they had to carry him out. And Josephus says that happened. And here, Luke tells us why it happened. He got dressed up in his royal apparel. What Josephus says is he was wearing a garment that he saw Caligula wear that had silver in it. And so you can picture this guy in this brilliant, with silver threads, and the sun is shining off of that white and silver cloak that he's got on, and he looks like a god, kind of. He's glowing like an angel in the sun. And then he's talking, and they're trying to butter him up. And they would say things like this to Caesar, too. "You're the voice of a god." They would say that kind of things. The Gentiles do. But Herod's over the kingdom of the Jews, right? He should know better than to take praise upon himself that belongs only to God. He knows that's blasphemy for people to say that. But he just soaks it in. He doesn't say anything. A little pretty full of himself. He's thinking of himself more like Caesar than what a man that's associated in any way with God's people should be acting. So they call him a god there in the crowd to try to win him over, and he just accepts that and doesn't make any reproof and say, "No, don't talk about a man like that." That kind of praise should only go to God. So all of that wanting to persecute the church to please the Jewish people doesn't sound like it was real sincere as far as trying to do the godly thing, does it? And immediately an angel of the Lord struck him because he did not give God the glory, and he was eaten by worms and died. So immediately after they gave that praise and he accepted it, he just doubles over in excruciating pain in his stomach, and they have to carry him out, and he lingers, I think it's 5 days before he dies, but in excruciating stomach pain the whole time. And what was the cause of it? These worms were eating him from the inside out. And it killed him. And we're told that God struck him is the reason that he died. It was a punishment. So, you think these persecutors get away with persecuting God's people? They don't. History is full of this. You look back at all of the Herods and people Caesars and so on, that persecuted Christians and burned churches, and almost always just a few years later they get theirs. It's just over and over throughout history it's been that way. God is watching. and he avenges his people. And he beheaded James, but he's going to pay, right? Yeah. We leave vengeance to God. He can take care of it. He took care of Herod. What happened to Herod the Great that killed those babies and tried to kill Jesus? Same thing happened to him right after that. That happened to Herod. He had a horrible sickness. His servants couldn't even come in and be around him. He stank so bad from rotting away. And God knows how to deal with the wicked. And he deals with this man. So here's a man who knew the law of Moses, and yet he persecuted these innocent Christians just for political reasons, and put James, the Lord's apostle, to death. And now he is dead. So that's the end of that persecution. What happened last time? It was Saul, right? Saul led the persecution. He was breathing out threats and murder, and then he goes to Damascus and he gets converted, doesn't he, on the road? Becomes the chief, the apostle that's the biggest evangelist of all. And here you got the first civil ruler that persecutes the church. And what happens to him? He gets eaten with worms and dies. And the church goes right on preaching the gospel. And you see that, again, with all of the Roman persecutions. There's 10 great persecutions. And it looks like they would just stomp the church out. But something always happens that ends the persecution too soon, and the church goes on. Right? It rebuilds. It comes back stronger than it was before. Over and over again. So there is a moral, just governor over the universe out there. Look what happens in contrast to what happened to Herod and all of his power and all of that influence he had. But the word of the Lord continued to grow and be multiplied. So here's the contrast. Herod, he was a big shot. He got all that power really fast, just over a short period of time. He had all the power there in Palestine, and God took it away from him in a moment, and he was out of the picture. So fear God and keep His commandments. That's what we should do. Don't fear men. So again, contrast to the evil, the church is continuing to teach the gospel and share it with other people. And congregations are being established as the word is growing and spreading. Don't you think the faith of James and the way that he faced death would have been an encouragement to people? There's life after death. Look at how James died for the faith. He knew that he wasn't ruined because they cut his head off. He went to paradise, right? He was in a better place. What about Peter? Did Peter get all upset? He was sleeping calmly when the angel came to deliver him out of that, right? But there is a God in heaven. And there is the Lord Jesus Christ that they keep preaching about. And they're preaching and converting numbers of people. So anybody else want to share some thoughts that you've got? Yes. About what these stomach worms are or whatever? Yeah. This comes from, people that look at some of these worms that get in people, parasites and things that eat you up. But, an aid to understanding any book is to also study about the history of the time and the culture at the time and what their customs were and practices were and what the laws were. All of those things help us to. Those people that read the book of Acts for the first time, they knew all of that. That was their culture they grew up in. And so it is important to study history and study dictionary, encyclopedias and so on. It does help to put you in the time and the place. So you really have, I'm not quite finished with this chapter yet. I forgot this verse. We had to get Barnabas and Saul back. They went on their mission to take that contribution to the poor Christians in the churches of Judea. They knew a famine was coming. It was foretold by the prophet Agabus, and they told that they gave a contribution, and Paul and Barnabas went down and visited the churches of Judea. This is all happening at the same time as Herod and the things he was doing in Jerusalem. And Barnabas and Saul returned from Jerusalem when they had finished their mission, taking along with them John, who was also called Mark. So we got Barnabas and Saul. They delivered the money to the elders. And again, Paul preached to those churches down there. It's mentioned later. And the only time in his life that you can fit in him preaching to the churches of Judea is right here. There's no other place in the book of Acts or about the life of Christ that you can fit that in. So it shows he didn't just send the money to Jerusalem and Jerusalem sent it, like a sponsoring church type thing. But they actually went to each of those congregations and delivered the money to the elders. And then they return back through Jerusalem, and they pick up John Mark. John Mark has been introduced, right? Luke introduces the people a lot of times in the book before they become prominent. And here John Mark is the mother of Mary that had that house where the brethren met. It's thought maybe she's the one that had the upper room where Jesus had the Last Supper. That's the same house. And remember there was a young man that followed Jesus and the apostles when they left the upper room. And when they came to arrest them in the garden, they tried to grab this young man and he ran out of his clothes, left his tunic behind and ran off naked. It's thought that was John Mark. It was at Mary's house. He followed them out there and ran away. And that's how it's only in Mark's gospel that's mentioned. So anyway, this John Mark, he's been around what's going on with Christ and the apostles right from the beginning. And he's Barnabas' cousin, we find out later in the book. So there's a good reason why they would choose him to come with them and be a servant for them and help them in their evangelism. They would take John Mark. So John Mark gets picked up and taken. He's going to do similar work for Paul and Barnabas like Timothy and Titus are going to do later. They do similar helping. But here it's John Mark that's going to be the servant when they go on their first missionary journey. Yes. What food they're letting in or letting out through their port. So the book of Acts is, a way to divide the book of Acts or think of the book of Acts is 1 through 12 is part 1. 13 through 28 is part 2. In the first half of the book, it's mainly the church at Jerusalem. It's mainly Peter, right, is sort of the main apostle you study about in the first half of the book. We're finished with that part. And now it's going to be about Paul. It's going to be Paul and his missionary journeys and his influence. And it's going to be the church at Antioch that sends him out. That's the main kind of hub of things instead of Jerusalem. So there's a natural dividing point here in the book of Acts. 1 through 12 and then 13 through 28. It's interesting the way Luke writes. He's such an excellent historian that he uses all kinds of Jewish language and Jewish ways of delivering the sermons and everything. The language is colored with this Jewish background. And now it's going to be Gentiles, and so it'll have a different flavor to it as you read the second half of the book. So as we've studied in the introduction to the book, he ranks at the top of ancient historians. He's right up there with anybody when it comes to telling the story. And his work is to be admired just on that level, apart from the inspiration and all. So here we have in chapter 13, we're going to get to the first missionary journey of Paul. Verses 1 through 3, they're set apart for the work there at Antioch to go and preach by the Holy Spirit's command. And then their labor in Cyprus and their journey over to Paphos to Antioch is in this chapter. Paul's first sermon is recorded that we have in the book of Acts at Pisidian Antioch in verses 16 through 41. Going to be a lot of parallels with Peter's sermon and Paul's sermon and Peter's sermon, right? It's the one gospel that they're both preaching. So there's going to be similarities. And the results, after he preached that Sabbath, the next Sabbath, the whole town turns out. And the Jews become jealous and start blaspheming Paul and the gospel. And then Paul leaves the Jews and starts preaching to the Gentiles. And they're very happy about it. And many of them are converted there in Antioch of Pisidia. And then the final results of what happened there. So there's sort of the outline of the chapter. And verse 1 says, "Now there was at Antioch in the church that was there prophets and teachers, Barnabas and Simeon, who is also called Niger, and Lucius of Cyrene, and Manaen, who had been brought up with Herod the Tetrarch and Saul. So beginning here, we had the spread of Jerusalem, then to Judea and Samaria. That's another way to look at Acts, chapter 8. You start spreading out in the Jewish lands there, and then now you're going to the Gentiles. Now you're going out to the wider world here in the next part. The gospel going from Antioch to the Gentile world. Antioch was, again, we talked about, just strategically located as a great city, the third largest city in the Roman Empire, and a great seaport was nearby and had great influence, to send the gospel to east and west. And so it was a very good spot for the gospel to springboard to the rest of the Roman world, is from the city of Antioch and the church that's located there. And notice they have their prophets and teachers. And in the New Testament, you have people that teach the gospel, and then you have prophets. Every prophet is a teacher, but not every teacher is a prophet. Prophets are inspired. They get the word directly from God. The teacher has to study it and then teach it, right? Well, we'll come back and look at these things. I think that was the second bell, right? Lord willing, next time.